Hello everyone, and welcome to the 181st episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring General Grievous from the Star Wars franchise. Well, I missed May the 4th by a few days, but it's been a while since I've covered a Star Wars villain, so I figured it was time that I give it another go. Featured in The Revenge of the Sith for a grand total of 8 minutes, General Grievous, much like Boba Fett when the original trilogy was released, became a fan favorite upon his introduction, which is evident by the bevy of material Grievous has been featured in both the current canon and in the now-defunct Legends continuity. And within these stories, we're given much more about this dread cyborg that significantly enhances his character and transforms him from a relatively minor yet memorable footnote in Revenge of the Sith into one of the most iconic villains in the entire franchise. Now there are many Star Wars characters that I'd like to cover, but I figured the last villainous lightsaber wielder that appears in the first 6 films would be best to check off the list before diving into other character stories. Now, unlike the first 4 videos I made on Maul, Dooku, Vader, and Palpatine, I'm going to include Expanded Universe, or Legends content as it's referred to now in this video. I regret not doing so with those 4 videos, and I'll eventually either remaster them or make update videos to talk about the material I left out in those videos. So in this video, I'm pretty much just going to consider a lot of the Legends material we're about to discuss as being a part of Grievous' story, and while that may not exactly be the correct thing to do as far as canonicity is concerned, I'm going to do it anyway, as I'm sure many of you watching this video appreciate Legends material just as much as I do. With that being said, I'm not going to discuss every single thing Grievous has done, as I've more so included information that better helps us understand his character and how he became the monster that he is. So if you know of anything in particular that might be of interest that I left out here, please let us all know down in the comments. Also, I was recently featured on an episode of Julian Dory's podcast, which you can check out if you're interested in something like that by clicking the link you're seeing on your screen now, or by clicking the link down below. And I've also recently started uploading my videos to Spotify if you'd prefer to consume these videos there, which is another link that you can find in the description. Now without further ado, let's begin. To understand the maturation of the Kaleesh male that was known as Kai-Mane Hai Shilal into the dread cyborg terror that is Grievous, one has to examine the conditions that he was raised in. The Kaleesh are a humanoid reptilian species native to the planet Kalee, which is located in the region of the galaxy known as Wild Space. Now, Wild Space is an interesting sector of the galaxy, as unlike the mapped but unexplored unknown regions where beings like Grand Admiral Thrawn hail from, Wild Space is a largely unmapped and unexplored region on the fringes of the galaxy beyond the Outer Rim, a region that contains many dangerous planets and star clusters that makes traversing this territory a monumental task, even for the most well-equipped explorers. Because of the hostile conditions of Wild Space and its isolation from centralized governments that have been formed in the galaxy proper at different points over the long history of the galaxy, the peoples who inhabit this region are largely left to their own devices and have only ever received token support from whichever government holds sway over the galaxy at any given time. The Kaleesh are one such people. A warlike and primitive tribal society, the Kaleesh formed a culture that is based around honor, tradition, spirituality, and combat, utilizing bladed weapons and lower-tech slug throwers to engage in ceremonial hunts with deadly beasts like the Mumu and the Karabaks, so they can form their signature cloaks and war masks from parts taken from their carcasses. War and trophy hunting are essential parts of life for the Kaleesh, and warfare between tribes was considered both honorable and sacred. And along with their pre-established pantheon of gods, the Kaleesh religion venerates those who prove themselves either in combat or through other good deeds, and elevates such worthy people to the status of gods after they've perished. However, the constant warfare amongst the various Kaleesh tribes ensured their society was marked by a constant state of poverty, and life on Kalee was often swift, brutal, and violent. This is the world that Kai-Mane Hai Shilal was raised in, and along with presumably owning his combative abilities in various intertribal wars and learning battle tactics, strategy, and the use of weapons, Kai-Mane also fought in the Bathavarian War, a war that the Kaleesh were conned into fighting on behalf of the Republic when the Republic managed to convince them that the Bathavarians threatened their territory. And after winning this war, many of the Kaleesh would take beings known as Rogwarts as trophy pets, including Kai-Mane, a pet he named Gore that would serve as a guard to his fortress on the third moon of the planet Vasek. And it would seem that Gore had the distinction of being one of the few living beings that Kai-Mane actually cared for. While the direction much of his life would take was decided by Kaleesh society, culture, and traditions, Kai-Mane's destiny was ultimately decided by something neither he nor the Kaleesh could control: off-world interference. Like any planet in the galaxy, over the thousands of years since the advent of space travel, Kalee has been subject to visitation by off-worlders with less than desirable intentions, and the constant warfare and impoverished conditions that the Kaleesh were forced to endure were only exacerbated on Kalee by the interference of interlopers, like the old Sith Empire. But there was no such force that the Kaleesh couldn't contend with, and in time, each threat to their livelihoods were pushed back. That is until the Yamri of planet Huk set their sights on Kalee. The Yamri are an insectoid species who had access to much more advanced technology than the Kaleesh, and upon gaining hyperspace technology, they began to conquer surrounding systems as their homeworld became increasingly overpopulated. This eventually led the Yamri to Kalee, a neighboring planet which they swiftly conquered, massacring the Kaleesh and selling millions of them into slavery. For a time, the Kaleesh suffered heavily at the limbs of their new insectoid overlords, but then rose Kaimain-Hai Shilal to challenge the Huk threat, as is told in the story of General Grievous that was featured in the 86th issue of Star Wars Insider. And here we also receive insight into how Kaimain became the dreaded cyborg, known only as Grievous. Once upon a time, General Grievous, the cybernetic killing machine, and supreme commander of the droid armies of the Confederacy of Independent Systems, did not exist. Instead, there lived a brilliant but barbaric man. His name was Kaimain-Hai Shilal, born amid unending war on the malnourished world of Kalee, where the reptilian inhabitants were untouched by the galaxy's justice. For generations, the planet had been embroiled in what the Tusk natives called the Huk War. Though Huk was the planet their Yamri adversaries came from, the name became a Kaleesh slur over generations, translating as soulless bug. The Huk were a technologically superior enemy, carnivorous, some said cannibalistic, quick to anger, and covetous. They used their advanced technology to plant colonies throughout their system, without regard to the welfare of other worlds' indigenous species, sentient or not. What mattered to the insectoids was wealth mineral deposits and other resources useful for trade. They colonized and pillaged such planets as Abaji and Tovarskal, and when the insectoids arrived on neighboring barren Kalee, they decided to expand their trade to include the planet's only valuable commodity, slaves. It wasn't long before the spirited Kaleesh rebelled against the Outlanders, waging a war with primitive lig swords, shoni spears, and slug throwers. Raised during such brutality, Kaimain-Hai Shilal grew to hate the aliens, and his father gave vent to the boy's anger by teaching him a slug rifle's pinpoint precision. He found his son had a sharp mind and a knack for marksmanship. By the age of 8, Shilal was an expert sniper, having already stained Kalee with the blood of more than 40 Yamri carcasses. By 22 standard years, Shilal's extermination count had soared, and the Kaleesh considered the young soldier a demigod. Another Kaleesh warrior and master with a sword, Ronderu Lij Kumar, was Shilal's closest comrade in arms. She wore a mask carved from a Karabakh skull, a match for the Mumu mask that Shilal inherited after his father died in battle. Kumar drilled the art of swordsmanship into Shilal. He reciprocated by introducing her to the satisfying feel of a Serka Outland rifle. The pair fought side by side in countless campaigns against the Yamri invaders, hacking and impaling the enemy. Some say Kumar was Shilal's long-lost half-sister, others say that she was his lover. In either case, the bond they shared was sacred and total. They were twin demigods blessed by their ancestors. While fighting together, the pair appeared invincible, but fighting separately was another matter. While separated from Shilal during combat on the beaches of Kalee, Kumar died violently on the barbed shears that were the Yamri's natural appendages. Unable to reclaim his comrade's body from the hungry waters of the Genoa Sea, Shilal felt an anguish akin to being pierced through the gut, his soul slowly seeping from the wound. Inconsolable, he embarked on a perilous journey across the ocean to the distant island monolith of Abesmi, beseeching his gods to raise Kumar from her sea grave so that he could see her one last time. But the gods denied him. Shilal tried to bury his grief by taking 10 wives and fathering 30 sons and daughters. He eventually realized that it was his destiny to mourn his loss as long as he lived, and so he took the name Grievous. He also decided not to suffer his endless agony alone. Grievous became the most savage warlord Kalee had ever known, a match for the galactic despots of old. He trained a select number of equally tortured and bloodthirsty Kaleesh braves, calling them his elite, and together they massacred scores of Huk invaders until the toll reached the thousands and the Huk were driven from Kalee. Grievous, with an unquenched bloodthirst, pursued the Yamri to the aliens' colony worlds, conquering the invaders' planets one by one, attacking both military and civilian targets with equal force. The vengeance-bent militants rampaged as far as Tovarskal before they were stopped. The Yamri, in league with the Trade Federation, pleaded with the Republic to intercede on their behalf, and the Republic Judicial Department sent a Jedi team, led by Masters Tachuka Deun and Himar, to adjudicate the conflict. With Senate pressure, both masters ruled in favor of the Yamri and imposed sanctions and reparations on the Kaleesh, including the forced return of the colony worlds. The Huk War ended, and Grievous, bred for battle, saw little choice but to return to his family. The effects of the Republic's sanctions were staggering. Kalee was economically decimated, and the Kaleesh died in droves. Grievous simmered with hatred for the galactic government and the Jedi who served it as he watched his wives die of starvation and saw his children kidnapped and subjected to the worst acts of depravity. Into this madness came Intergalactic Banking Clan Chairman San Hill, an emaciated Mun who looked as though he too were half-starved. He conspired to employ Kalee's greatest champion as a collections agent. In exchange, the banking clan would share the burden of Kalee's enormous debt. Grievous was disgusted at the idea of serving the mega corporation, deeming it nothing more than the work of a glorified leg breaker. Still, the innate fighter could not resist the promise of renewed conflict. Grievous began his new occupation by aggressively collecting from such worlds as Ord Mantell and seizing Moonless flute design systems. Because the banking clan would not hire Grievous's Kaleesh warriors, he demanded more intelligent battle droids to serve him. With Count Dooku's permission, Chairman Hill complied, putting the IG-100 Magna droids into production. Hill also upheld his promise to help alleviate Kaleesh's deficit and reinstate trade. But when Grievous learned that the Republic did nothing to the Yamri for vandalizing hallowed Kaleesh burial grounds on the colony worlds, he abandoned his contract and returned to Kalee to avenge the desecration. San Hill was not amused by the broken commitment. He considered ordering Grievous's assassination, but Hill worried that the warrior would survive and avenge any such attempt. Instead, the crafty Mun and the Geonosian Archduke, Poggle the Lesser, devised another plan, one that would make Grievous a permanent ally. Before Grievous and his Kaleesh elite took off in Grievous' ship to renew the Huck War, Hill and Poggle joined Count Dooku in arranging to have an ion bomb planted aboard the ship and rigging Grievous's pilot seat. Upon the bomb's detonation, the troop carrier plunged into the Genoa Sea. Grievous was remotely ejected from the wreckage at Dooku's command. Soon after, Grievous was dragged from the cold waters, hemorrhaging and in shock. Dooku used a jolt of Sith lightning to keep the warlord from succumbing to cardiac arrest. Then Magna droids dragged the unconscious general to a nearby shuttle, where FX medical droids quickly went to work. While unconscious, Grievous dreamed he had joined the gods and was among the spirits of his ancestors. But when he awoke, he discovered he had been butchered and gutted by surgical droids and left to recover in a Bacta tank. Chairman Hill offered the general a new proposition, one that would put his full talents to use as the leader of the largest droid army the galaxy had ever seen, and promised to fulfill his agreement to relieve Kalee of famine. There was only one catch. Grievous would have to become a cyborg. Every remaining bit of life, save Grievous's vital organs, spinal cord, and brain, would be disposed of in favor of an impervious droid body. The Kaleesh warrior only wanted to be put out of his misery, but when Hill brought Grievous's barely surviving wives and children before him, the general finally agreed, requesting pitifully only to keep his own eyes. The deal was done, and a monster was born. Made of ceramic armorplast and uranium, Grievous's robotic chassis resembled an ancient Krath war droid, able to withstand volleys from a starfighter laser cannon, to say nothing of blaster bolts. Like the violent Ebronite race, his droid body boasted dual opposable thumbs on six-fingered hands. These claws connected to electro-driven, voluntary bisectable metallic forearms, and humeri, which effectively gave Grievous 4 upper limbs, each capable of wielding a weapon. Electrified synthrope veins ran the length of these arms, which were useful when he wanted to incapacitate his victims. The immense magnetized talons that were his feet not only allowed him to scale walls like a spider, but with anti-grav repulsors built into his Durasteel legs, these same talons could be used as 2 additional appendages. And as promised, his haunted reptilian eyes peered from his droid visage, not only intact, but also cybernetically enhanced. Unsatisfied with his soulless face, however, the narcissistic general carved a new armorplast death mask that resembled his father's, and had it grafted onto his alloy skull. He also donned a dramatic armor-weave cape, resembling the simple one he'd worn during the Huck War. His internal organs were collected in a pressurized synth-skin sac and protected with his duranium abdomen. The debilitating transformation required Grievous to recuperate for a number of months. In his new form, Grievous was first unleashed within the catacombs of Geonosis during the preliminary battle of the Clone Wars, where he facilitated the Separatist Council's escape from Republic forces by killing entire clone trooper companies and a number of Jedi with his steel claws. Grievous left none alive and began his ritual of collecting lightsabers as spoils of war. Dooku was impressed with Grievous's performance and decided to begin his training in earnest. The Sith Lord gave Grievous the lightsaber belonging to the late Jedi Master Sifo Dyas, whose midi-chlorian-rich blood, from his cryogenically frozen corpse, had been used to keep Grievous alive after his shuttle crash. Already an expert swordsman, Grievous quickly picked up the classic styles of Jedi lightsaber combat. He also was aided by the subtle alterations the Geonosians had made to his brain, which improved his equilibrium and agitated his rage centers. Grievous trained his new IG-100 Magna droids and took to calling them his elite, like his old Kaleesh companions. Soon after Geonosis, Grievous was let loose on Space Station Trenchant against the Confederacy commanders Asajj Ventress and Dirge, whom he bested handily. It was the last test of Grievous's skills, and afterwards, he was granted the title of Supreme Commander of the Separatist Droid Army. Before long, the entire galaxy came to know of Grievous's existence. The HoloNet news networks dubbed him the Night Slayer, and the name was well earned. Grievous's exploits following his debut on the planet Hypori are well chronicled. He embarked on a Jedi slaughtering spree that encompassed many worlds in many systems. In his wake, Grievous left a trail of dissected Jedi, as many as 100 of whom he personally killed, including several of those who originally cut short his havoc at the Hutt colony world Tovarskal. Grievous eventually returned to the flame-grass plains of that world, commanding his droid army to begin what he'd begun during the Huck War, frying its Yamri population to a crisp. Lesser known are the General's attempts to stifle his private demons. The Geonosians tried to tamper with Grievous's memory centers to weed out any psychological baggage, but the General remained proud and vainglorious. Chief among his obsessions, his need to prove his worth as a soldier of fortune. No one had truly expected the blood transfusion from Master Sifo-Dyas would give Grievous the powers of the Force, but the prideful general nonetheless interpreted his lack thereof as a personal failure. His expectations were only encouraged after he tangled with the Jedi Iron Knight on the planet Zagobah. There are 2 known examples of Grievous attempting to dabble in cyber experiments. One involved the Begrufta clan Padawans, whom Grievous captured after killing their Abyssin master Quarmal. 2 years after Geonosis, Grievous subjugated the planet Gentes, intending to enslave its Ugnaught population, but then abruptly changed his mind and began murdering the miserable creatures when he found their foundries easily adaptable to his purposes. Backed by the monies of Newt Gunray and the Trade Federation, the Gentes factories began creating battle droids, as well as a handful of Duranium bodies, much like Grievous's own. The Separatist Supreme Commander intended to replicate the cybernetic procedure that had been carried out on him, using young, Force-sensitive captives. His efforts were spoiled, however, thanks to the intervention of the Jedi deserters Bedard Tone and Flynn Kaibo. Soon afterward, Grievous paid a visit to the planet Nelvon, which had been brought to his attention by the Techno-Union foreman, Wat Tambor. The general was quite taken with the similarities between the spiritual Nelvon warriors and his own Kaleesh people. In a twisted form of kinship, Grievous intended to make these warriors his new elite, and he lured the male soldiers away from their tribe by making them believe he was a prophesized figure out of Nelvon mythology. The warriors were captured, mutated by Skakoan combat engineers using unique microelectronics, and remade into hideous cyborgs. Grievous's crude experiment was eventually sabotaged, and Anakin Skywalker freed the Nelvanians at the expense of his own prosthetic arm. This is a fantastic explanation of Grievous's story, but it's told to us from a third-person perspective that doesn't really explain how these events were viewed from Grievous's perspective. But fortunately, we have this excerpt from Labyrinth of Evil by James Luceno to give us a bit more insight into Grievous's thoughts on his life and the direction it's taken. In dreams, Grievous remembered his life, his mortal life on Kalee, and in the aftermath of the Huck War. After all the close calls on battlefields on his home system worlds, on Huck worlds, sowing destruction, exterminating as many of them as he could, after all the times he had returned home wounded, bloodied to the bone, surrounded by his wives and offspring, basking in their support, relying on it to recall him to life, after all the brushes with death, to be fatally injured in a shuttle crash. The unfairness, the indignity, had caused him more pain than the injuries themselves. To be denied a warrior's death, as was his due. Floating suspended in Bacta, keenly aware that no healing fluid or gamma blade wielded by living being or droid could repair his body. In moments of consciousness, seeing his wives and offspring gazing on his ravaged body from the far side of the permaglass, offering words of encouragement, prayers for his return to health, he had asked himself, could he be content to be a mind in a body without feeling? More, could he abandon a life of combat for a life in which the only battles he fought were with himself, the struggle to endure, to live another day? No, it was beyond him. By then, the Huck War had ended, more accurately, had been ended by the Jedi, and the Kaleesh were still reaping the whirlwind, their world in ruins, their appeals for justice and fair play ignored by the Republic. Ever on the alert for investment opportunities, members of the intergalactic banking clan had offered Kalee a dubious sort of rescue. They would support the planet financially, assume its staggering debt, if Grievous would agree to serve the clan as an enforcer. Their Hailfire weapons were proficient at delivering payment reminders to delinquent clients, and their IG series assassin droids took care of the wet work. But the Hailfires had to be programmed. The IGs were dangerously unpredictable, and assassination was bad for business. The clan wanted someone with a talent for intimidation, both to save his world and to provide himself with a touch of the life he had known as a warrior, a strategist, a leader of armies. Grievous had accepted the offer. IBC chairman Sandhill himself had overseen the details of the arrangement. Still, Grievous wasn't entirely proud of his decision. Debt collection was a far cry from Warcraft, an arena for being without principles, for being so attached to their possessions that they feared death. But Kalee had profited from his work for IBC, and Grievous's previous notoriety was such that it could not be eclipsed. Then, the shuttle crash, the accident, the misfortune. He told his would-be healers to fish him from the Bacta tank. He could bear to die in atmosphere or the vacuum of deep space, but not in liquid. In the shadow of felled trees that would fuel his funeral pyre, he lapsed in and out of consciousness. That was when Sandhill had paid him a second visit, something consequential in mind, obvious even to someone who could barely see straight. "We can keep you alive," Rail Thin Hill had whispered into Grievous's unimpaired ear. Others had promised as much. He pictured breathing devices, a hover platform, a surrounding of life-sustaining machines. But Hill had said, none of that. You will walk. You will speak. You will retain your memories. Your mind. I have my mind, Grievous had said. What I lack is a body. Most of your internal organs are damaged beyond the repair of the finest surgeons, Hill had continued, and you will have to surrender even more than you already have. You will no longer know the pleasures of the flesh. Flesh is weak. You need only gaze on me to see that. Encouraged by the remark, Hill had talked in glowing terms of the Geonosians, how they had raised cyborg technology to an art form, and how the blending of living and machine technology was the future. Consider the battle droids of the Trade Federation. They answer to a brain that is also nothing more than a droid. Protocol droids, astromechs, even assassin droids, all require programming and frequent maintenance. Two words had caught Grievous's attention. Battle droids. A war is brewing that will call many droids to the front, Hill had said just loudly enough to be heard. I am not privy to when it will begin, but when that day comes, the entire galaxy will be involved. His interest piqued. Grievous had said, a war begun by whom? The banking clan, the Trade Federation, someone more powerful. Who? In time, you will meet him, and you will be impressed. Then why does he need me? In every war, there are leaders and there are commanders. A commander of droids. More precisely, a living commander of droids. So he had allowed the Geonosians to go to work on him, constructing a duranium and ceramic shell for what little of him remained. His recuperation had been long and difficult, coming to terms with his new, and in many ways improved self, even longer and more difficult. Only then had he been presented to Count Dooku, and only then had his real training begun. From the Geonosians and the members of the Techno-Union, he had already come to understand the inner workings of droids. But from Dooku, Lord Tyrannus, he came to understand the inner workings of the Sith. Tyrannus himself had trained him in lightsaber technique. In mere weeks, he had surpassed any of Tyrannus's previous students. It helped, of course, to have an indestructible body reminiscent of a Krath war droid, the ability to tower over most sentient beings, crystal circuitry, 4 grasping appendages. In dreams, he remembered his past life, but in fact, he was not dreaming, for dreams were a product of sleep, and General Grievous did not sleep. He endured instead brief periods of stasis in a pod-like chamber that had been created for him by his body's builders. While inside that chamber, he could sometimes recall what it had felt like to live, and while inside, he was not to be disturbed, unless in the event of inimical circumstances. Now there are some slight variations on Grievous's origins, depending on the continuity you're looking at, like the fact that Grievous had actually chosen to take on certain cybernetic enhancements prior to his near death in that spaceship crash, but we'll discuss that aspect of his person a bit later on. So aside from these differences, the general structure of his story remains the same, and from his origin story, we're given a lot to discuss. Apart from being quite literally created through warfare on his homeworld and off of it, we learn that Grievous is not just some simple cybernetic maniac with an insatiable bloodlust and penchant for collecting trinkets, but a man who has been exploited and traumatized by constant loss and betrayal during his formative years that have hardened him into a vengeful monster who has legitimate justification for despising the Jedi. Something that's explored quite often in stories involving the Clone Wars is the fact that the Separatists aren't just made up of a group of bankers, merchants, and trade unionists backed up by dark forces who are seeking wealth and power, but of peoples of various species who have been either abandoned by the Republic and Jedi or slighted and abused by them in some way. And though the Separatists are secretly run by the true villains of this story, many of the people aligned with them wholeheartedly believe that the Republic and the Jedi are the villains. While Grievous would eventually become a being who is fully invested in the nefarious intent of his dark masters, he began his life as a Separatist proxy through the same circumstances. A man whose people were being ravaged by an off-world colonizer who, when they needed the Republic and the Jedi the most, were betrayed by them in the worst way they could in this particular situation. So not only was Grievous hardened by the warlike conditions present in his people's culture and society, but he became disillusioned with the powers that be, and subsequently embarked on a quest to avenge everything that he held dear that had been destroyed by forces outside of his control, which are aspects of any living being's struggle that might send them down a similar path that Grievous took. So it would seem to me that a pre-cyborg Grievous, though brutal and unforgiving, was actually rather justified in waging the various wars he waged on behalf of his people. And in Kai Main-Hai Shilal's world, the Jedi and the Republic were without a doubt the villains. This aspect of Grievous's life isn't problematic, as plenty have lived and died as freedom fighters whose cause was justified, much like Grievous's was. No, the problem with who Grievous was, and where he came from, is the fact that barbarity and war were facts of life that significantly impacted his worldview, which along with the trauma he suffered through the frequent deaths of those closest to him, conditioned him to be a merciless merchant of death who cared not for anyone or anything aside from the Kaleesh, and a man who wanted nothing more than to see the Jedi and the Republic they represented reduced to dust. But what Grievous did to himself in his efforts to become the man who could save his people is what really transformed him from being a righteous avenger into nothing short of a vengeful monster. Now, was Grievous justified in seeking to eradicate the Jedi and the Republic? In a way, yes he was. Because of the Jedi and the Republic's intervention on behalf of the Huk, the Kaleesh were forced to suffer more than they already had during the Huk War, and it's reasonable to assume that exponentially more Kaleesh suffered as a result of this intervention than there were Jedi in the entire Order. As at the start of the Clone Wars, the Jedi numbered around 10,000, so punishing an Order that was complicit in causing the suffering of an entire species that outnumbered them 100 to 1, as well as the institution that they aided and worked for as agents of their will, seems like a righteous enough cause to pursue. What makes Grievous's efforts here not so righteous is that they were spurred by a desire for vengeful justice, not true justice. Vengeance and the pursuit of it might seem like a prudent direction to take when you and your people are forced to suffer at the hands of others, but vengeance almost always destroys the person or group seeking it, leaving them satisfied in the moment they achieve their victory, yes, but more hollow than they had been at the start of their crusade. And while that might have not been the case for Grievous or the Kaleesh that followed him, when you consider the warlike aspects of their culture, you'll typically always find that you managed to cause even more suffering to others, or even your own people, while you were too busy destroying your enemies, rather than attempting to find a more appropriate solution to your issues, like perhaps attempting to make changes within the Republic itself, by gathering data about the Huk's crimes, and advocating for reparations, aid, and justice for your people in the Republic Senate. However, at this point in time, the Republic was quite corrupt, bloated, and mismanaged, which is why the Huk were able to convince Republic leadership that they were the victims in this scenario. And while Grievous could have taken the path of peace and attempted to make things right in a more diplomatic manner, it's more than likely that that would have been an either slow or completely impossible process that would have provided no reprieve to the suffering the Kaleesh were enduring during this time period. So even though Grievous's crusade against the Jedi and the Republic was founded on vengeance, rebelling against a power that has marginalized so many that one has little to no hope of changing from within, seems to be a justified course of action to take. And again, I can't really fault Grievous for seeking to destroy the Jedi and the Republic in order to free his people from the wrongs they've committed against them. The problem with what Grievous was doing is that he was so blinded by hatred, anger, and his desire for vengeance that he adopted the attitude that he would do whatever it took to make sure his people were avenged. And that left him vulnerable to being manipulated by forces looking to take advantage of such a man. And unfortunately for Grievous, he was targeted by the one person who was liable to abuse his talents in person in a way Grievous could have scarcely imagined: Darth Sidious. As we learned through the stories I read to you earlier, Grievous was made into the monster we all know him as through the machinations of both Sidious and Dooku, a being of pure rage and hatred, who was more cruel and merciless than he was prior to his transformation. And while I'm sure he wouldn't have erred from his course had he never been corrupted into this beast, the enhanced combat capabilities and the tweaks made to his personality made it so that Grievous was no longer a minor threat looking to uplift his people in any way that he could, but a bona fide war criminal who was directly responsible for the death and suffering of billions of sentient lives. Now, as far as said personality is concerned, there isn't much to say beyond the fact that Grievous was a being totally consumed by what he had become and what he wanted to achieve. And in every instance we encounter Grievous, he shows himself to be nothing short of a walking death machine who takes great pleasure in massacring his enemies and collecting trophies from them. A man who is the most extreme embodiment of the warlike ideals of his people, whose every waking moment is geared towards conquering all he encounters without any shred of remorse. Even so, there is yet another excerpt we can look to for more insight into Grievous's personality and his internal struggles, which I've taken from the story A Droid with a Heart that can be found in Star Wars Myths and Fables. Once during a long ago war, there was an organic soldier who so admired the cool logic of the droids and wanted so much to mirror their infallibility, strength, and power that he took to replacing parts of his own organic body with a series of carefully crafted mechanical components. At first they were simple enhancements, a cybernetic hand here, a data interface module there, but soon he came to see the full benefit of the new mechanical components and the way they enhanced his life. This was particularly true in battle, where the removal of nerve endings and easily damaged limbs meant he could take on even the most fearsome opponent without fear of pain or wounds. Nor did he have to hold back in his attack for fear of reprisal, as damaged droid parts could be easily repaired or replaced, and the new components offered significant enhancements over his previous form. He had, for example, adopted forearms rather than the original two that he'd been granted at birth. Victory in battle led to further modifications, and in time, the soldier became utterly obsessed with the notion that he might eventually replace nearly all his weak genetic material and thus transform himself almost completely into a droid. In such a way, he believed he might enjoy the benefits of both the organic and the inorganic, all the strengths and versatility of a droid, with all the cunning, passion, and capacity for emotion of an organic life form. The soldier would strive to become a droid in body while remaining an organic creature in heart and mind. So the soldier continued in that fashion, and through the course of many years and many battles, adopted, tinkered with, and otherwise altered his own body until he was no longer recognizable as the person he had once been, more machine than organic, more droid than man. The soldier was pleased, for he alone understood his true potential, and although he had the outward appearance of a machine, he retained some of what had once made him a living, breathing man. This, he believed, set him apart from all others. Although neither organic nor droid found themselves comfortable in his company, the soldier had achieved much in his life, and through the many campaigns he had fought on behalf of his masters, he had risen in the ranks, claiming victory upon victory. In part due to his sheer commitment to becoming the very best soldier he was able, he made a mark for himself amongst the powerful men and women who led the separatist movement. Soon enough, the soldier found himself promoted to the rank of general and given command of vast armies and fleets, for in him, the leaders of the separatist movement saw strength and power and the will to succeed. His gambit had paid off, and his success reinforced his belief that, in crafting for himself a new form, he had risen above all others. Even the Jedi shuddered at the mention of his name and feared joining him in battle, as none could match his sheer relentlessness and determination. Yet despite his martial success, the general remained unhappy. For though he had altered his body, he was not satisfied with his lot in life. In truth, he would never find peace or completion in the continued modification of his form, for deep down, he sought escape, and no matter how much he might change what he was, he could never change who he was. Being a creature who was ruled by his heart, however, the general could never see that in himself. Thus this general who would be a droid was a tormented soul, and he expressed this torment by the only means he knew how: violence. The more the general altered his body, the angrier and more vindictive he became, lashing out at all those he perceived as weak, often destroying the droids placed under his care and leadership, for in some ways, they reminded him of his own weaknesses. The general could not see the similarities between himself and those he bullied, believing that he was not like the droids at all, that he was stronger, better, because of his organic heart. So when you factor in the notion that Grievous was modifying himself before he was completely transformed, despite his hard exterior and the terror of his actions, Grievous in many ways is a tormented soul that one can find much pity for when you take into account all that he's experienced and what he was conditioned to become by the circumstances of his birth and the corrupting influence of the Sith. Though that may be the case, there is no excuse for the many horrid things Grievous can be held responsible for during the Clone Wars. While Sidious and Dooku were ultimately responsible for the war itself, Grievous was responsible for prosecuting that war. And if Sidious and Dooku can be blamed for orchestrating the events that caused the deaths of billions of sentient beings, Grievous can be blamed for carrying out their orders and personally seeing to it that their designs were made a reality as the supreme commander of the Separatist droid army and perhaps the deadliest Jedi hunter the galaxy had ever seen. Now, though Grievous has found himself in less than desirable positions and was forced to take some considerable losses during the course of the war, he's actually a brilliant strategist and tactician who was also responsible for some of the Confederacy's greatest victories. Much of this has to do with the fact that he was already a seasoned commander prior to his enlistment by Sidious and Dooku, but he was also afforded opportunities to succeed in battle by virtue of the fighting force he commanded, the droid army, which by the end of the war numbered in the quintillions. Because he had no reason to value the lives of his soldiers, and indeed Grievous held the battle droids he commanded in little regard, Grievous was able to throw untold legions of droids at his enemies to overwhelm them or to accomplish suicide missions that would have otherwise been questionable to order if his forces weren't so easily expendable. And not only did he have access to these droids, but highly advanced superweapons and ships that could decimate entire populations in an instant was a deplorable tactic that Grievous was fond of using to force his enemies to choose between saving civilians or pursuing Grievous and his armies. Though his position as the overlord of the Separatist armies and the actions he took in this position is ultimately what facilitated 99% of Grievous's crimes, the terror of General Grievous is not simply found in what he is ordered to be done, but what he's personally done. I've said it already, but Grievous is perhaps the most accomplished Jedi killer in galactic history, claiming hundreds of lightsabers to add to his personal collection, from the lowest of Padawans to some of the greatest masters of the Order. While his training with Count Dooku gave him the necessary skills to accomplish such a feat, his cybernetic enhancements is what really enabled Grievous to contend with most Jedi, as Grievous isn't force sensitive, and if he didn't have robotics on his side, he wouldn't have anywhere near the level of skill required to defeat illustrious members of the Jedi Order in combat. But with these augments, Grievous is not only more than a match for most Jedi, but the other skilled combatants who are allied to the Separatists, like Asajj Ventress or Dirge. And aside from Count Dooku and Darth Sidious, Grievous was without a doubt the most skilled and dangerous fighter in the Confederacy. While he often relied on these mechanical advantages, or the overwhelming strength they gave him to end a fight as quickly as it began, Grievous was not above using underhanded tactics to surprise his opponents and defeat them when things weren't exactly going his way. And though Grievous held contempt for nearly all life, especially Jedi life, his roots in an honorable warrior culture often pushed him to praise braver skilled enemies and treat them with more respect in battle should he feel that they earned it. Fear is also on Grievous's side whenever he's fighting a Jedi, as his gruesome death mask, raspy electronic voice, and four-limb fighting style is enough to strike the utmost terror into even the most seasoned Jedi. However, Grievous, like most representatives of the darker aspects of sentient life, was prone to overconfidence and frequent underestimation of his enemies, and along with his obsession with collecting lightsabers, a facet of his person that often moved his focus away from the fight that he was currently engaged in, Grievous was prone to arrogant miscalculations that nearly caused his death on several occasions. But with a body made of metal, Grievous was capable of weathering or sustaining heavy damage to his person that he could either shrug off or repair later on, making him a nigh unstoppable force of whirling horror that, if it weren't for the organic components of his body, would have made him effectively immortal. But alas, poor Grievous was ultimately undone by his organic parts, earning himself a warrior's death at the hands of a man who could be considered one of the greatest Jedi who ever lived, which is something that the once honorable Kalish, even as the monster he became, could have appreciated. But what would have happened had Grievous not fallen to Obi-Wan on Utapau? What would his fate have been had he lived to see his master's plans come to fruition? Well, it wouldn't have really been all too different. You see, Grievous, more so than being the effective commander Sidious and Dooku needed to guide the war effort, was always destined to become one thing, and one thing only once the war had concluded: the Fall Guy. Grievous, with his terrifying appearance and his deplorable actions during the war, had become nothing short of the entire galaxy's boogeyman. And while the war itself helped Palpatine to consolidate the massive power that he did by the end of the war through various constitutional referendums that granted him emergency powers, Grievous is what helped to sell these mandates to the Galactic Senate. Not only was the Separatist movement a threat to Republic sovereignty, but they were an organization that was headed by a murderous maniac who went from system to system, annihilating entire populations and leaving utter ruin in his wake. Grievous was the best propaganda piece that Palpatine could have ever asked for, and that's why he designed him to be the monster that he was. So no matter whether or not he died at the hands of the Jedi or made it to see the end of the war, he was always going to perish in the end. As though it's possible that Palpatine may have found a use for him helming some division of his new Imperial military, Grievous was far more valuable as the defeated beast of the Separatists than he would have been as a continued instrument of warfare. Even if his mentor Dooku lived to see the rise of the Galactic Empire, he would have found no help from him either, as Dooku believed that he and his master would have absolved Dooku and his cause of much of the blame for the war by placing the blame on Grievous, the mad and murderous cyborg who had hijacked the noble Separatist cause, allowing Dooku to return to the galactic fold and take his place at his master's side as co-ruler of their new empire. Palpatine would have never let that happen, of course, but it's still worth mentioning that Grievous was doomed the moment he agreed to become the cyborg general of the Separatist armies, no matter what happened. So this is who General Grievous was, a man who endured terrible tragedies that was formed through war and martial tradition to become a vengeful monstrosity who was hell-bent on taking revenge on the people responsible for the suffering of his people and his loved ones, a man obsessed with becoming as strong as he possibly could for his people and to achieve his revenge, in the process becoming an accessory to some of the worst crimes that were ever unleashed upon the galaxy. But perhaps the most tragic thing about the monster that Grievous became is that he could not fathom nor did he care to consider the fact that what he was doing to other sentient beings in the Clone Wars was the exact same thing that had happened to his own people, a suffering that he had loathed to endure, that he was happy to dole out on others. A man who could not see past his rage and hatred to understand that he had become a worse version of the very thing that he swore to destroy. While Grievous is rightfully reviled by the galaxy at large, and his legacy is one of darkness, the man who was Kaimain Hai Shilal is still considered a god by his people, a man who utterly destroyed himself to ensure that they might live in a world free of hardship and strife. And for that, he can be commended. But for so much more, he can be condemned. The man whose legacy continued to inspire monstrosities like NK Necrosis and Commander Carbon. And whatever Grievous once was, by the end of his life, he had become a man who embodied yet another aspect of the purest evil that the galaxy had ever seen. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Grievous? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, and anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.